when Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed to travel to China for a high-profile summit with some of the world's most important non-Western leaders. He had a very specific set of goals in mind. He wanted to project strength, both through Russia's alliances and through his own presence as a global statesman. He also wanted to be seen among people who would outwardly support his invasion of Ukraine, breaking the sense of isolation that Western sanctions and political pressure have imposed on him. But what he encountered in China was something very different from what he had hoped for. Instead of gaining legitimacy and backing, Putin left the summit humiliated. His allies refused to endorse his war, and even worse, he was reduced to playing a bit-part role while China, the partner Russia once thought of as an equal, demonstrated that it has long since surpassed Moscow in both economic and military weight. From August 31 to September 1, China hosted the 25th annual Heads of Council meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, better known as the SCO. Once a gathering of a small handful of countries eager to stand apart from the West, the SCO has grown into a semi-global forum. This year, more than 20 leaders, representing what CNBC called non-Western countries, arrived in Tianjin. On paper, this was meant to be a powerful display of non-Western unity. China, as the host, was always going to take center stage. But Russia also sought to use the event to show it still matters. Within the shifting balance of global power, a chance for Putin to argue that a multipolar world is forming, and that Russia belongs near the top of that order. At first glance, the summit seemed to achieve that goal. A massive military parade was staged. Photographs circulated of leaders mingling, smiling, shaking hands. Putin was briefly able to step out of the isolation that has dominated his world since the war in Ukraine began, and play the role of a leader among peers. The SCO is designed to send a message to the West that its influence is waning, and that the so-called Global South is rising as a new force. Sergei Redchenko of Johns Hopkins University put it clearly in an interview with Times Radio on September 1. They represent a lot of economic might. You have China, you have India, which became a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, alongside Pakistan a few years ago. You also have Russia, which perhaps is not as economically important, but still a major power. Even in his framing, Russia is being diminished, an afterthought compared to China or India. And that hint of Russia's fading relevance would only deepen as the summit progressed. Redchenko went on to explain how the SCO countries trumpet the idea that the West is declining into irrelevance, positioning themselves as the true powers of the modern era. For Putin, this is an attractive narrative. He will happily attend any gathering that lets him posture against the West. But when it came to his deeper goals for the summit, merely being another voice in the chorus was not enough. He wanted something far more specific: open support for his invasion of Ukraine. One country at the summit has given him that backing: North Korea. Last year, Moscow and Pyongyang signed a defense pact. Since then, North Korea has been sending both soldiers and equipment to aid Russia. Yet while useful, North Korea is an isolated and distrusted state. Its endorsement carries almost no weight on the global stage. What Putin desperately needed was a major player to step forward, ideally China, or perhaps India, and offer legitimacy for his war. China might have seemed like the natural candidate. It has certainly helped Russia by selling dual-use components that can end up in military applications, microchips, metal alloys, aircraft engines, and fiberglass among them. A report in the Telegraph from September 2 highlighted just how wide-ranging these sales are. But what sticks in Putin's mind is what those sales are not. They are not direct weapons shipments. They are not an official endorsement of his invasion. China has carefully maintained a position of neutrality. When it speaks of Ukraine, it uses diplomatic language, calling for peace talks and a negotiated end to the conflict, without ever siding with Moscow. As recently as August 6th, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun reaffirmed this stance. On the Ukraine crisis, China's position is consistent and clear. We have been committed to promoting talks for peace and the end of fighting. Whether China's actions truly match its words is less relevant than the fact that it has never once offered Putin the explicit statement of support he craves, and that was what he traveled to Tianjin seeking. If not from China, then maybe from India, or from any other country beyond North Korea. The Guardian reported on August 30 that Ukraine was expected to be at the top of Putin's agenda during the summit. Alexander Gabuev of the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center said, "It is an important time for them to talk about where the war is headed and how likely it is to be stopped in the near future. The two leaders need to compare notes and make sure they are on the same page. This is important because the war has become one of the main pillars of their relationship." For Putin, that was the crux. He wanted Xi to publicly take Russia's side, or at least echo Russia's talking points. But when the summit ended, that support was nowhere to be found. Franek Vikorka, chief advisor to exiled Belarusian opposition leader Svietlana Tsikhanouskaya, explained it bluntly. "I think this summit was actually a failure for Putin, too, because in the final declaration, there was not a single word about the war in Ukraine from the Russian position, and I think that Putin did not manage to convince Xi to take the Russian position regarding Ukraine. For Putin, the humiliation was twofold. First, his most important request, an expression of legitimacy for the war, was flatly ignored. Second, the broader reality of the summit underlined just how far Russia has fallen behind China, where once Moscow stood as the world's second superpower. Today, Beijing holds that title. Economically and militarily, Xi's refusal to back Putin is more than diplomatic caution. It is a reminder of who holds the dominant role in the partnership. The New York Times described the summit as a carefully staged show of unity, masking deep divisions. Putin's obsession with Ukraine puts him at odds with leaders like Xi and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who are trying to balance anti-Western rhetoric with the need to preserve lucrative trade ties with the West. The SCO's message of unity is, in practice, hollow. This disunity was evident even in the speeches. Putin used his time at the podium to rail against the West and to highlight his meeting with Donald Trump in Alaska, trying to pull Xi into a conversation about Ukraine. Xi, by contrast, used his speech to urge SCO members to oppose Cold War mentality, bloc confrontation, and bullying. It was almost a veiled criticism of Putin himself. China also remains wary of Russia's tightening relationship with North Korea. While Beijing values Moscow as a partner, it does not appreciate Putin cozying up to an unpredictable state that could complicate China's global ambitions. The subtle message was clear. China wants Russia to follow its lead, not the other way around. Analysts have described the Russia-China relationship as one of big brother and little brother. The Asia Society Policy Institute asked as far back as 2023 whether Russia could ever get used to being the junior partner. By 2025, the answer seems clear. China's economy is 10 times the size of Russia's. Its military modernization is far ahead, and Russia, weakened and isolated, is more dependent on China than ever before. The Australian Institute of International Affairs went so far as to call Russia a vassal, arguing that China is simply exploiting Russia's desperation, whether through discounted oil, purchases, or lucrative sales of dual-use components. China now buys nearly half of Russia's crude oil exports, accounting for 47% as of June 2025. On the surface, this looks like lifeline support. In reality, it is Beijing taking advantage of discounted oil prices, knowing Russia has no choice but to sell. India and China together make up nearly all of Russia's oil market, leaving Putin with no leverage. This imbalance was underscored at the summit by what came next: China's massive military parade in Beijing. According to CNN, more than 50,000 spectators watched as 10,000 soldiers marched alongside advanced weapons, anti-ship missiles, undersea drones, air defense lasers, even robotic dogs. This was a showcase of innovation and strength. For Putin, the contrast was painful. He has long loved military parades as a way to project Russian power. Yet Russia's parades have shrunk dramatically since the war began. The Journal of Democracy noted back in 2022 that Putin's Victory Day parade was already losing steam, with fewer vehicles and a tone of propaganda rather than triumph. The Economist later pointed out how the numbers kept dropping. Over 2,000 vehicles in 2021, 1,275 in 2022, just 9 and 10 in 2023, and little improvement in 2024. Russia's 2025 Navy Day parade was even cancelled entirely, due to fears Ukrainian drones might strike the ships. What once were grand displays of power have become reminders of Russia's weakness: lost equipment, staggering casualties, and the inability to safely hold parades without fear of attack have robbed Putin of a vital propaganda tool. So when Putin stood in Beijing, watching China's military parade outshine anything Russia could hope to stage, his humiliation was complete. He failed to win the political support he came for, and he watched his partner demonstrate superior military strength on a scale that Russia can no longer match. Behind the handshakes and posed photos, the truth was impossible to ignore. China is the senior partner. Russia is the junior. Beijing is playing the long game, using the SCO and its growing influence to position itself as the world's leading non-Western power, while Moscow is left clinging to relevance. New Sky captured it in a September 4th report. Experts see the summit not as the birth of a triune bloc, but rather as a game of mimicry. Beijing is playing go, closely watching the reaction of the United States and its allies, testing the possibility of taking a leadership position in a world where the West is losing its clear influence. Noticeably absent from that assessment, Russia, the very country that once styled itself as a great counterweight to the West, is now almost irrelevant in this new narrative. And that, more than anything, is the humiliation Putin faced in Tianjin. Humiliation in China is not the only recent embarrassment for Russia's president. Even his supposed fifth-generation fighter jet, the Su-57, has become a symbol of failure, with foreign buyers, including China, showing little interest. And as long as Putin keeps chasing approval he will never receive, Russia will remain in the shadow of the very partner he once believed he could control.